Would you believe a dog led officers to the only place they hadn't searched? And what they found made even the toughest cops cry? Because by that point, everyone thought she was gone forever, and yet this canine wouldn't stop barking at the storm drain, not for food, not for orders, not for anything. And when they opened it, the world stood still, because what lay beneath that cover? In the cold, wet dark was something no one expected to see alive. It was supposed to be just another sleepy Friday in Pine Hill, a quiet neighborhood where kids rode bikes till sundown and neighbors still waved from driveways, where the loudest thing most evenings was the hum of sprinklers or the bark of a dog behind a wooden fence. And that morning, little Emily Hartman had gone off to school with her rainbow backpack and a plastic pony clipped to the zipper. Her mom, Dana, stood at the doorway watching her skip down the sidewalk, calling out, "Don't forget your lunch this time." And Emily turned and gave that wide grin, the one that could light up every dark corner in Dana's heart, and just like that, she vanished from the world because she never made it to school. And when the teacher called around noon asking if Emily was sick, Dana felt something hollow punch her chest. And the panic spread like wildfire, and before the sun had even begun to set, the entire town had turned into a search grid. People combing woods and creek beds, helicopters circling, every second stretching into eternity. And in the middle of that chaos stood a single dog, tail still, ears up, gaze sharp. His name was Axel. A 4-year-old German shepherd who'd been partnered with Officer Dean for 2 years, trained in search and rescue, and known at the precinct as calm, silent, and relentless when he caught a scent. And yet, nobody knew that this time, this case, would change everything. And as hours passed and leads grew cold, Dana stood by the street holding Emily's favorite pink jacket, whispering her name into the wind like a prayer, and even as she broke down, surrounded by flashing lights and officers trying to stay composed, Axel sat beside her, quiet but alert, nose twitching as if picking up a whisper no one else could hear. And then suddenly, just before midnight, when most of the search had paused to regroup and families had gone home to light porch candles and hope, Axel growled, low and steady, and bolted down the street without a command, Officer Dean barely able to catch up, shouting for backup as they followed the dog into the dark. Down the sidewalk, past the yellow tape, toward the middle of the road, where a circular storm drain sat untouched. Unnoticed, just another piece of city metal, until Axel began to scratch at it. Then bark, again and again, louder and louder, each one like thunder tearing through the silence. And soon, officers swarmed the spot, tools in hand, lifting the grate. With sweat and urgency, and inside, nothing could be seen at first. Just shadows and the glint of damp concrete until someone aimed a flashlight down, and in that beam just beneath the lip of the pipe, barely moving, was a small hand, curled, trembling, fingers twitching like they were reaching for light. And the moment that hand was seen, the silence shattered. Radios blared, ropes were lowered, and 2 officers crawled in, calling Emily's name, their voices cracking as they inched closer until they reached her, weak, soaked, but alive, her lips murmuring the word mama again and again. And when she was pulled up into the night air, wrapped in a blanket, the street erupted into sobs and gasps. Dana fell to her knees, screaming her daughter's name, and Axel, still sitting by the edge of the drain, simply watched, his head slightly tilted, as if he already knew all along where she had been. And in the days that followed, the town changed. The news spread like wildfire, not just about the girl who had survived 48 hours alone, but about the dog who had refused to give up, who had barked at a hole in the street when every human eye missed it. And for weeks after, flowers were left at the storm drain. Children tied ribbons around the nearby trees, and people came just to see Axel, to touch his fur, to say thank you to the one who didn't speak, but listened when no one else did. And if you're watching this right now, just take a moment to breathe, maybe even wipe your eyes, and ask yourself, what would your dog do if something happened to you? And more importantly, do we really understand just how much they feel? How much they know, and maybe, just maybe, they hear the things we don't, sense the things we miss, and protect us in ways we'll never fully understand? Comment below. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it right now? Weed? Love to know how far this story of Axel and Emily travels, because some stories deserve to be remembered forever. They say trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers for years. And in the quiet days that followed Emily's miraculous rescue, the town of Pine Hill looked the same. The trees still waved gently in the August breeze. The mail still arrived at the same time each morning, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. Because everyone had seen how quickly life could slip into darkness, how a few missed seconds, a single wrong turn, could change everything. And while Dana sat by her daughter's bedside in the recovery wing of St. Jude's Children's Hospital, brushing knots out of Emily's tangled hair and trying to act like everything would go back to normal, the truth was that nothing about her baby girl was the same. Not the way she stared off into the distance when people talked to her, not the way she refused to let anyone but Axel into the room, not even her father, Brian, who stood helplessly outside the door most hours just listening to his daughter breathe. Because in those 48 hours underground, something had happened, something she hadn't found the words for yet. And while doctors ran tests and therapists scribbled notes, it was the dog who seemed to understand her without needing any explanation. Every day arriving beside Officer Dean in his cruiser, waiting outside the hospital until visiting hours began, and then padding silently into room 214, nose nuzzling Emily's wrist, her fingers gripping his fur like it was the only real thing left in the world, and no matter how much she cried or shook or whimpered in her sleep, Axel stayed, like a statue with a pulse, steady, watching, listening. And one afternoon, as Dana sat by the window staring at the parking lot below, she asked Officer Dean something she hadn't dared ask out loud before. Do you think he knew exactly where she was the whole time? And Dean, who'd been with Axel since his first training session, just nodded and said he didn't rest, not for a second, like he was hearing something we couldn't. And Dana whispered, or someone, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to smile. Because maybe, just maybe, love doesn't need words or logic. Maybe it only needs a heart that refuses to give up. And as Emily's body healed faster than anyone expected, her mind was slower to return, until one stormy night. Lightning flickering beyond the windows and rain tapping like fingers against glass. She sat upright and whispered something so soft Dana almost missed. He waited for me. Mama. And Dana turned, her voice cracking. Who did, baby? And Emily touched Axel's paw and said he was there in the dark. And though the doctors might have dismissed it as imagination or memory confusion, Dana knew in her bones that it wasn't, because that night, something had pulled that girl back from the edge. And the next morning, when Officer Dean came to bring Axel back home, Emily refused to let him leave, clinging to his harness and crying harder than she had since the rescue, so they agreed temporarily to let Axel stay, just until Emily was strong enough to come home. And in the meantime, Axel became more than a visitor. He became family, sitting at the foot of her bed during physical therapy, walking beside her wheelchair during hallway laps. At every time another child cried in the night, Axel would get up, leave Emily's side for just a moment, and go sit beside the other child's bed until the sobbing stopped. Like he was carrying more than just one child's pain, like he'd taken the whole hospital floor under his care. And word started to spread, not just locally, but nationally, about the dog who didn't just find a missing girl, but stayed to help her find herself again. And soon journalists were knocking, cameras were rolling, producers were calling the police station asking to interview the team. But Dean declined most of them, saying Axel wasn't doing it for fame, that he wouldn't understand the microphones or the lights. He only understood one thing: his people needed him, and he was going to be there until they didn't. And that simple truth resonated far beyond Pine Hill, because families across the country started writing letters, sharing their own stories of dogs who had shown up at just the right moment, of times they felt watched over, protected, saved. And Dana started reading those letters to Emily every night before bed, each one like a lullaby, reminding her she wasn't alone, that others had felt the same thing. And with each passing day, Emily spoke more, smiled more, even laughed once when Axel tried to steal her grilled cheese sandwich and pretended not to know where it went. And though the nightmares hadn't stopped completely, they had softened, and that was something. And then, exactly 1 week after she was found, Emily stood up on her own 2 feet for the first time, gripping the rail of her hospital bed with one hand and Axel's harness with the other. Her legs wobbling, but her heart steady, and everyone in the room clapped. But it was Axel's tail wagging that made her giggle, and in that sound, Dana heard her daughter returning, piece by piece, and that night. As the nurses dimmed the lights and the rain began again, Emily whispered, "He didn't just find me. Mama, he brought me back." And Dana kissed her forehead and said, "Then we owe him everything." And in that moment, under soft hospital lights and the hum of machines, a bond was sealed, not just between a girl and a dog, but between a town and its silent protector. And if you've made it this far in the story, tell us, has a dog ever protected you when no one else did? Share it in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from, what time it is there, because maybe this story isn't just about one missing girl. Maybe it's about all of us who have ever needed someone to believe we were worth finding. The strange thing about healing is that it rarely happens the way you expect. It doesn't move in a straight line or obey the logic of medicine. It swells and shrinks like the tide, surprising you with sudden progress one day and quiet setbacks the next, and that's exactly how it unfolded in the weeks that followed Emily's return. Because though she was home now, back in the warmth of her familiar bed with fairy lights on the ceiling and her favorite stuffed dolphin tucked beneath, her pillow, the shadows of what had happened still lingered in the corners of the room. And every time the wind howled outside or the lights flickered during a storm, Dana would see that flicker of panic in her daughter's eyes. And she knew then that survival wasn't the finish line, it was just the start of a much longer journey. And through it all, Axel remained a quiet presence, padding from room to room, sleeping at Emily's door. Sitting silently beside her during school lessons, she was now attending remotely. And while therapists and doctors visited during the day, it was Axel who made the biggest difference. Not by doing anything dramatic, but simply by being, by offering. A kind of presence that didn't need words. And slowly, the town of Pine Hill began to reflect that same shift. The people who had once passed each other in silence at grocery stores now stopped to ask how Emily was doing. Who once walked their own dogs without eye contact now smiled and shared stories. And in the center of that quiet transformation was one German shepherd with steady eyes and a calm soul. And when word spread that the mayor was planning a small ceremony to honor Axel's role in Emily's rescue, it was as if the entire town exhaled at once, ready to acknowledge something they all felt but didn't yet have the words to say, that this wasn't just a dog. This was a symbol of hope, of protection, of something good and pure and steady in a world that often felt anything but. And on a warm September afternoon, the town square filled with people holding signs, wearing shirts with Axel's face, children, balancing on parents' shoulders, just to catch a glimpse. And when Officer Dean led him up the steps of the gazebo, decorated in yellow streamers and pawprint balloons, the crowd erupted, not in loud claps, but in that kind of awe-filled hush that sometimes says more than sound ever could. And Dana, standing beside Emily in the front row, had tears in her eyes, not just because of what Axel had done, but because of what he continued to do, even now, even in silence. And the mayor handed Axel a custom gold tag shaped like a heart, with the words "Our town's hero" etched into it. And the moment Dean clipped it to his collar, Emily, for the first time in public since her return, stepped forward and knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. And the photo taken in that moment, of a girl returned from the dark, hugging the dog, who pulled her out, would appear in papers across the country. And more than that, it would become something framed on dozens of fridges around town, not just because it was touching, but because it reminded people of something deeper. That love, real love, often comes without language. And as the ceremony ended and the sun dipped behind the trees, Axel seemed unfazed by the attention, already pulling toward the sidewalk, ears twitching as if sensing something else. And that night, something new happened. Something that surprised even Officer Dean, because as they returned to the precinct, Axel sat beside the lockers for almost 10 minutes, staring at Dean's duffel bag where his old Sir Chandraskew vest was stored, and Dean knelt beside him, opening it out of curiosity, and Axel leaned forward, nudging it gently, like a quiet reminder, like he was saying, "We're not done." And Dean, who had worked with K9 units for over a decade, felt something stir in his chest, because this wasn't normal behavior, this was intent. And later that evening, when Dean shared the moment with Dana over the phone, she paused for a long time and said, "Maybe he knows someone else is waiting." And though it sounded like a guess, the truth was, she believed it with every fiber of her being, and so did Dean. Which is why the next morning, before anyone else arrived, he clipped the vest back on Axel, adjusted the straps, and simply said, "All right, let's go." And just like that, they were back on patrol, back in motion, and no one knew then that it would only take 2 days before that vest would matter again. Because on the outskirts of Pine Hill, in a small neighboring town called Bellriver, another case was unfolding, a different kind of disappearance. This time a teenage boy named Carter who had been missing for 36 hours. His last seen near the lake trails on the edge of the woods, and when the call came through, Dean didn't even have to speak. Axel was already waiting at the cruiser door, tail still, eyes alert. And as they drove toward Bell River, a strange silence filled the air, not heavy or dark, but charged, like the seconds before a storm. And when they arrived at the command post, it was chaos officers circling maps, drones flying overhead, parents sobbing into coats. And Dean walked Axel through the area slowly, letting him take in the scene, letting him listen in the way only he could. And after nearly an hour, Axel stopped, nose low, then began walking. Not fast, but steady, turning down a trail that had already been marked and cleared by other teams. But Dean followed, knowing better than to doubt him, and 15 minutes in, Axel stopped cold.
Ow.
Ears pinned back, growling low, and then he ran, bolting through the underbrush toward something unseen, something calling only to him and Dean. Sprinted behind him, heart pounding, shouting for backup, not knowing yet what they were running toward. Only knowing one thing: when Axel ran like this, it meant someone was waiting to be found. And if you're still with us, if your heart's racing like ours is, we want to know, have you ever seen a dog do something that made you believe they were more than just a pet? Share your story in the comments and tell us what time it is where you're watching from. Because stories like this deserve to echo far beyond one town, one rescue, one child. They deserve to be felt by all of us who know what it's like to need saving. The sound of branches snapping under hurried footsteps echoed through the woods as Officer Dean tried to keep up with Axel. The leash now unclipped, the forest thick with summer humidity. Sunlight barely slipping through the canopy above, and Dean's voice cracked as he shouted, "Axel, what do you smell, boy?" But the shepherd didn't look back, his focus laser sharp, his ears forward, navigating through thick brush, across muddy patches, down an incline, so steep Dean had to grab onto roots to steady himself. And then, just past a clearing, Axel stopped dead, not barking, not growling, just staring, in place at the edge of a shallow ravine. And as Dean caught up, panting, brushing leaves from his face, he followed Axel's gaze in there, tucked beneath an outcropping of rock and ferns. Barely visible was a boy's sneaker, half covered in mud, its laces dragging in a shallow, a pool of water, and beside it, curled like someone trying to disappear, was Carter, pale, trembling, eyes fluttering in and out of consciousness, his lips blue, a makeshift tourniquet wrapped clumsily around his ankle. And Dean dropped to his knees, radioing for medics, his voice cracking as he said, "We've got him, he's alive." And as other officers arrived with stretchers, Axel didn't move, didn't bark or wag, just stood quietly beside the boy's body like a sentry, like someone guarding not just a life, but a story. And Carter, through cracked lips, whispered, "I saw the dog in my dream before I woke up," and the EMT beside him looked at Dean, goosebumps rising on her arms, and softly said, "That's the second kid who said that." And Dean nodded, not surprised anymore. Because this wasn't coincidence, it was something else, something deeper. And when Carter's mother arrived, collapsing into her son's chest as he was loaded into the ambulance, she turned and hugged Dean, tears soaking his shoulder, whispering, thank your dog, please," and Axel now lying beside. The wheel of the stretcher rested his head between his paws like the moment had passed, and it was time to rest again and back in Pine Hill, whose news of a second miracle spread. Emily sat on the floor of her living room, crayons scattered around her, drawing what looked like a forest with a shadowed figure in the middle. And Dana, leaning over her shoulder, asked, "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" And Emily said, "That boy the dog saved. I saw it on the TV," and Dana smiled, touched by how her daughter, once mute with trauma, now spoke with gentle ease. Her voice warm, her eyes bright, and as Emily finished her picture, she scribbled one last word under the drawing: brave. And Dana knew she wasn't just talking about Carter, but Axel too. And the next day, the mayor of Bell River called the Pine Hill precinct, asking if Axel could be honored again. And this time, it wasn't just a local gesture, it was a regional event. With cameras from across the state setting up tripods outside the town hall, and Dean was hesitant, worried about overwhelming Axel. But something in the dog's behavior said otherwise. He seemed calmer now, more grounded, like he knew people needed this story. Like he was ready to show up not just for those lost in the woods, but for the ones watching from hospital beds, living rooms, and broken places inside themselves. And the ceremony was emotional beyond words. Carter was there in a wheelchair, blanket over his knees, holding Emily's hand as they presented Axel with a second tag. This one shaped like a shield, with the words "Twice the Guardian" etched into the silver. And when the crowd chanted his name, Axel didn't react like a celebrity, but like someone who had already moved on in his mind, already listening for the next voice that needed him. And later that night, Dean sat in the quiet of the precinct locker room. Axel curled at his feet and he whispered, "I don't think. You were meant to be just mine." And for the first time in his career, Dean submitted a request to reassign Axel from a full-time patrol partner to a community support canine, a dog who could respond statewide to missing persons cases, therapy work, trauma recovery, whatever was needed, because it was clear Axel wasn't built for paperwork and office hours. He was meant to move, to find, to heal, and the department approved it unanimously. And within weeks, a new program was formed, K9 Outreach, with Axel as its founding face, and calls began flooding in, from schools, from hospitals, from shelters asking if Axel could visit, sit with children who wouldn't, speak with veterans who hadn't smiled in weeks. And at first it was one appearance a week, then 2, then 3, and everywhere he went. The same thing happened. People who had shut down began to open up, began to talk, or draw, or simply cry in a way they hadn't allowed themselves to in years. And Dean started journaling it all, documenting every stop, every person touched. Every moment of life began to mend, and the journal became a book, a self-published memoir titled Axel's Watch. And to their surprise, it went viral, landing on talk shows and morning interviews. And the proceeds were used to fund a foundation in Axel's name, offering free therapy support to families impacted by trauma, especially children. And one day, while watching a video of a boy in another state hugging Axel and whispering, "You helped my sister sleep again," Emily turned to Dana and said, "I want to help too." And from that moment on, she became a part of the outreach team, traveling with Axel and Dean when she could. Sometimes just sitting beside kids in silence like Axel had done for her. And something about seeing her alive, thriving, sharing her story, made the healing even more powerful for the ones she met. Because she wasn't just a survivor, she was proof, living, breathing proof, that it was possible to come back from the dark. And as the year passed and the seasons turned, Axel's story became a movement, a quiet revolution of empathy and care, showing people across the country that maybe the world didn't need louder heroes, it needed silent ones, four-legged, ones who didn't seek reward, only the next soul that needed them. And if you're here right now, if you've watched every second of this story, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it over there? And if you know a dog that changed your life, even in a small way, tell us about them in the comments, because sometimes the most important stories aren't the ones on the news. They're the ones we carry in our hearts. And maybe, just maybe, someone reading your story tonight needs to believe they can be found too. There's something sacred about quiet heroes, It's the ones who never ask to be seen but are impossible to forget. And in the years that followed, Axel became more than a story, more than a dog who rescued a child or comforted a grieving parent. He became a symbol, not just for Pine Hill or Bell River or even the state, but for anyone, anywhere, who had ever felt lost and needed to believe that someone, somewhere, was still looking for them. And the work he did stretched far beyond Sir Chandraskew. Now, because wherever he went, healing followed, like footprints in the snow melting behind him, warm and steady. And children who hadn't spoken in months suddenly whispered secrets into his fur. Veterans with haunted eyes unclenched their fists when he rested his head on their laps. And in every hospital hallway, every shelter, every community hall, he visited, the same hush would fall when Axel walked in, as if people knew, even before the first tail wag, something real had entered the room. Something no amount of medication or therapy could quite replicate, and Dean, always by his side, watched it all unfold like a man who'd been entrusted with a miracle, scribbling notes in his weathered notebook, keeping track of not just miles traveled or people met, but moments, the exact second a child's shoulders relaxed, or the precise expression on a mother's face when she saw her child smile for the first time in weeks. And as Axel aged, his muzzle graying slowly, his gait growing a little stiffer each month, the calls didn't stop, they only grew. And Dana, now a certified trauma counselor herself, began helping Dean build a proper training program for other handlers, using Axel's methods not as a checklist, but as a philosophy. Don't push, don't demand, just stay. Listen, be still, and let people come to you when they're ready. And Emily was now old enough to understand what had happened. To her, began speaking at schools, gently, bravely, telling students what it felt like to be afraid to be found, and to be held by something that didn't speak her language but still understood her heart. And one day, while giving a talk at a youth center in Ohio, she said something that would be quoted across hundreds of pages online. I think dogs are angels we're allowed to touch, and that quote was printed on bracelets, shirts, mugs. But the truth is, she never meant it as a slogan. She meant it as a quiet truth, something she learned not from books or adults, but from the moments she'd shared with Axel, silent, honest and life-saving. And as the calendar turned and the leaves began falling once again in Pine Hill, marking the 4th anniversary of that first rescue, a special event was organized. At the very same storm drain where it all began, not by the town or the police department, but by the children, the ones who had been touched by Axel in some way. Some who had never met him in person, but had heard his story and wanted to say thank you. And they gathered with handmade signs, their own dogs in tow, some holding candles, others stuffed animals. And when Axel arrived with Dean in a custom-fitted van, everyone stood still, the kind of reverent silence usually reserved for church or funerals. Not because they expected anything dramatic, but because they knew, deep down, that this might be the last time they'd see him like this. Standing tall, ears perked, eyes soft but alert, still listening. And when Emily stepped forward, now almost a teenager, her voice trembling with gratitude, she didn't give a speech. She just knelt beside him and whispered, "Thank you for finding me," and kissed his forehead. And Axel leaned into her, his tail thumping once, slow and deliberate. And in that moment, every adult in the crowd who remembered the night she was found felt their throat tighten. Because time may have passed, but the gratitude had never faded. And a few months later, in the comfort of his favorite spot near the fireplace at Dean's home, with Dana and Emily visiting for the weekend, with no pain, no struggle, just peace, Axel fell asleep and didn't wake up. And though the silence that followed was deafening, it wasn't heavy with sorrow, which was filled with reverence, because they all knew he had given more than any living being should be expected to give, and he had done it without complaint, without expectation. Just with that same steady heartbeat and that unbreakable instinct to listen, to follow, and to never, ever give up. And Dean, who had written down every rescue, every child's name, every story along the way, finished the final chapter of his journal with just 3 words. He never stopped. And that book, once self-published in a quiet corner of the internet, would now go on to inspire a national movement, funding canine units across the country, equipping shelters with therapy dogs, and building Axel's legacy into something eternal. And now, if you're here with us at the end of this journey, we want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? And what time is it over there? Because this story, this bond, this miracle, is never meant to stay small. It was meant to reach every heart that needed to hear it. So if you've ever loved a dog, if a dog has ever protected you, comforted you, saved you in ways others didn't see, tell us in the comments, because their stories matter too. If Axel's journey moved you even a little, share this with someone who needs it. 'Cause somewhere out there, another child is waiting, and maybe, just maybe, there's a dog listening, ready to find them, just like he found her, and just like he found all of us.